Good morning, everybody, and thanks, Patty, for a terrific paper. Thanks, Garrett and Zarza, for getting us where we are. Garrett has told me we don't have time for jokes, so for those who are interested in some footnotes on that great metaphor I gave you last night about the Native American name for that lake and all of that, the folks at home don't know what I'm talking about. I have done some linguistic research since last night, and I have more to tell you about it, so it's a more complicated story than I might have let on. It's a challenge to respond to papers that are in a kind of a state of development, in the sense that I think Patty has really amplified some of what was in the paper that I reviewed. So it's a little bit of a moving target, and I'll try to keep up with. She offered to show me the PowerPoint slides, and I thought, well, at that point last night, I'd probably be better off sticking with what I'd read. So some of this may be a tiny bit obsolete. This is a very detailed and comprehensive legal review, and I think it should be particularly valuable for our European friends who may not be as familiar with the American system, which is, I think, distinctly different from the European system in many ways. Garrett has earlier commented that the paper was a bit federal heavy. It still feels a little bit that way to me, and I believe Patty has agreed to flesh out the other levels in a future version. I think that will be helpful as well, because in part, it's good to know there is a federal role, and it's a significant one, and it could increase, but it's largely, as Patty has said, a state and local game in the United States. One area that I would suggest could be amplified quite a bit, and I've mentioned this to Patty informally, is the role of politics as apart from the role of law in land use control in the United States. And I think very often we find the law is clear, but the politics can be pretty confusing and surprising. And I'll just refer to a recent Supreme Court decision in Kelo versus New London, where, unsurprisingly, I think to most experts, the Supreme Court upheld the idea of taking a property for economic development, and this caused a firestorm in the country and a whole bunch of political action around a sort of rejection of that legal principle by people in practice. So how politics and policy work, sometimes not consistent with laws, is really an interesting aspect of this game. And just a general observation I would make about the United States, you could make a very strong case for a real private property tradition, and there is certainly a private property rights movement in the United States which gives a certain flavor to the way we approach land use. But at the same time, there's a very strong tradition of environmental regulation, which Patty does talk quite a bit about at the national level and below. And in many ways, this comes up against the private property rights tradition and causes lots of conflict and makes life very, very interesting for us. As has been mentioned, the U.S. has a very decentralized land use control system. In effect, there are 50 state systems, and they are not terribly restricted by constitutional standards. Obviously, there are certain requirements, but the states are really free to experiment, and as a result, we have seen experiments, and a number of them are going to be presented to you over the next 2 days. And that's probably a good thing about our system, and it makes it possible, for example, in the absence of national policy on climate, for some states to take the lead and begin to actually help us understand a path forward. I might recall that California did this with air pollution and got out in front of the federal government in terms of regulating automobile pollution that causes smog and so forth some years ago. Patty talks about the quiet revolution in land use control. Just to feel old, I have to say I was a quiet revolutionary. I began my career in Connecticut in 1972, implementing the first plan of conservation and development. And not only that, it makes me a 4 waiver, because I've been through all 4 of the major movements of land use control, either as a practitioner or a talking head. And that's starting to look like a long time. On the issue of national land use planning, yeah, I was there when there was, everybody thought there was actually going to be national land use legislation. And we were all studying Hawaii and thinking, maybe this is the future. And of course, Hawaii has very strong state land use control. More recently, we've looked back and said, well, in 1808, Thomas Jefferson kind of announced a national plan in terms of infrastructure. I think Andreas has commented on this in his paper. And then we thought, with some symmetry, in 1908, Teddy Roosevelt got going on sort of national natural resources plan with Gifford Pinchot. We started a project called America 2050, which said, well, maybe by 2008 we could have some kind of a national infrastructure plan. It's now 2012. We're still waiting. Second term, maybe. Patty talks about regional initiatives. She mentions my pet, the Cape Cod Commission. She's added Tahoe to the list, I think quite significantly. I was going to tell her she should do that. There's also the New Jersey Pinelands Commission, the Long Island Central Pine Barrens more recently, the New Jersey Highlands more recently. What's interesting to me here is that some of these regional systems deal with sub-state special areas, but some are really multi-state, like Lake Tahoe, and it really suggests a challenge for state land use planning, which is some planning is bigger than states and smaller than countries. There's a broad theme that could be developed that deals with regulatory approaches, as we see probably more dominantly in Oregon, and incentive-based approaches like that in Maryland. And there's literature on the effectiveness of these different approaches, but they really represent a different method of dealing with land use policy. Also on the federal agencies, again, I think Patty's gone more into this in terms of federal land ownership. But beyond the Department of Defense, certainly the Department of Interior controls a tremendous amount of land, and the states, through state trust lands, own pretty significant amounts of land in the West primarily, and that is land that can be alienated and developed and is intended to actually make money for state schools, for schools within states. So there are land use issues around state trust lands, which are also quite interesting that we've looked at. Just a couple of final thoughts. The stronger national role that Patty talks about in preempting local land use regulation. This is a very interesting movement. This deals with religious institutions, telecommunications, interstate energy corridors. It could extend to other things. Patty talks about fracking. There has been an absence of national standards. I think after the election we might or might not see something like a national policy on fracking, and energy policy is obviously going to be important. Two final thoughts. One, I think climate change is actually going to be an extremely important driver of land use policy and is going to test our land use control system. And in states like California, we're already seeing this working out explicitly. And then just the last big thought, I think very often the problem we have is to fit the land use system to a real geography. And very often we'll find that states and nation states are not real geographies. They're arbitrary and present tremendous governance challenges when it comes to actually doing land use control. Thanks very much.